Okay, so I wanted to do a brief review of your research paper proposal assignment so that you understand what's expected. So the purpose of the assignment is to make you proficient in crafting an effective research proposal. Proposals are important, whether or not you're planning on going to grad school, you're going to need to use proposals if you want to present your research at conferences. Often they're going to ask for a research proposal. And really, just if you want a clear, purposeful document of intent, research proposals are a very valuable step in the research process. So your proposal should have the following sections. So in the introduction, you're going to state the problem that your research is addressing. So you want to give a succinct picture of your arguments, and you're going to set the stage for the importance of the issue that you're addressing. Then you're going to introduce your research question. So keep in mind when you're writing this, why should the reader care about the issue? So you're going to, in your introduction, give a kind of a brief setup of the overall arguments for your paper. It doesn't have to be very thorough, right? This is just where you're kind of setting up generalities. So let's say you were studying something like income inequality. Then first in your introduction, you would define income inequality, and then set up what particular variables or factors or groups that you're going to be looking at with your research. So for example, if you're looking at income inequality and you were looking at stratification by gender or stratification by racial or ethnic groups, then you would, again, set up what is income inequality, why isn't it a problem that should be addressed, and then you're going to basically outline a brief kind of introduction that you're going to be looking at the stratification between men and women or between racial or ethnic groups or both, right? Just to set up so that when you're reading the introduction, you have a good idea about what's going to follow in the rest of the paper. And at the end of the section, you're going to specifically introduce your research question, right? You're going to state it as a transition into the next section. So you're basically going to set it up, kind of set up what the overall issue is, and then state your question. What is it that you're trying to look at in your research? Then, as far as your literature review, this is the section that should review at least 5 peer-reviewed academic resources that are relevant to your research topic. So these are theories, concepts, and researchers that give you context to the previous research done about your research topic. So you don't want a glorified annotated bib. So those drive me nuts, right? You don't want to basically just cut and paste, different articles into the mix. What you need to do is when you're looking at these resources, read them with a careful eye, right? You're not going to just tell me everything about, I don't need a summary of each resource. You only need the information from a resource that's relevant to your paper. So for example, let's say you're explaining a particular research that found relevant information about income inequality, right? In this research study between men and women, they found that, women earned 30% less on average than men, right? That's enough of the information I would need from that study for you to put that in the lit review. You don't need to tell me where the research was done, the title of the research. People often drag this out and add way more information that's necessary. You still, of course, need to accurately cite the information. I'm not saying don't explain where it's from. I'm just saying sometimes people will put oh, they did this kind of research design and there was 200 people that they did research on and this, and that. And you really have to ask yourself, is any of that relevant to what you're trying to make your argument about? Does any of that help your analysis or your argument or your point? If not, then do not include it, right? I'm not saying you should use research in a way that's not in line with the scope of the research itself or the intent of the research or what it found. I'm saying that you don't add a bunch of superfluous extra stuff that I'm just going to end up cutting out when I edit your papers later anyway. You want to really be looking at the article instead of letting the articles lead your lit review. You want to lead the articles, right? So what I suggest you do is use subtopics in your lit review, which a lot of you already are planning to do, which I saw through your outline assignments. But it's an important thing to have that kind of rigid structure within the lit review so that you can build into it like a framework. Then it's going to make logical sense, right? You kind of want to introduce concepts and then go more into the analysis later on. So, if you have those particular subgroupings, yeah, it's just going to give a better structure so that you're not kind of starting an argument, then going back and forth, or being inconsistent or not clearly developing your point. So, again, don't put in a whole bunch of extra crap. I'm really only looking for the information that's relevant from that research to what you're talking about. So that's what's going to be your challenge in constructing this, is you need to come up with 5 sources. So for your overall paper, you're going to need 10. So for this is basically like half of your lit review that you're drafting. Your proposal is basically like a half version of your literature review larger overall paper. So, this is an important place to kind of set up the groundwork. And then once you get your edits back from this, you often have an opportunity to add to some parts, tweak some parts here and there, to set you up for an effective paper later on. So another thing I ask, and I get into this in the lectures a little bit too, is just not to simply talk about the whole according to so-and-so, blah, 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 according to so-and-so, blah, blah, blah. I know that a lot of students have been taught to simply slap in a couple sources separately, right? But again, the subtopics are important because you should be organizing the research itself around those subtopics, not just simply grabbing 5 articles and having 5 paragraphs, and each paragraph is about an article, and then it goes on to the next one. That's more non-academic writing. That's much more like high school or lower level GE college stuff. What we're talking about here with academic writing, you need to be relating concepts and research to itself. Meaning, if you're using those subtopics within your literature review, so for example, like the one I used, income inequality and looking at stratification by gender, stratification by race, that's going to kind of set it up in a much better way than if you're, just trying to look at what is income inequality without any real barriers, without any real structures to analyze that. I do suggest that grouping them together, like the example here in your paper. If you had causes of poverty, you would put similar research into categories, right? So you don't want each paragraph to be its own research article. You want to group research articles that are similar or talking about the same thing together. So you would say, income inequality has increased in recent decades, right? That could be like an introduction sentence from your words to set up research that you're going to say. Then you can do your according to running ahead, where you put the citation information so you can explain what's in that research article. According to, blank, there's been a 20% increase in blah, 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 right? Then after the research that you've entered in there from a source, you're going to use a sentence to explain what that means. What does that 20% increase mean? How does that relate to what you're talking about, right? Sometimes you're going to actually compare and contrast research articles. You could say, some argue, some such as, blank research and introduce the research, argue that, this is largely a conflated issue, while other scholars argue that, and then, insert that citation information, that this is a pressing issue that should be taken more seriously within the culture or something like that. So you need to be, instead of just kind of like giving me an annotated bibliography where you just tell me everything about, you basically almost like do a cut and paste version of what a research article says. This is much more, you're analyzing the research article, you're pulling out the information that's relevant to your argument, and you're including the amount of that information that's relevant. The rest of it, you're not. You're not telling me that it was done at the University of Chicago and that these 12 different researchers, and listing all of their names, did the research, and that there were 1,200 participants and they did a double-blind study, the blah, blah, blah. Now, if the method is relevant, if the number of participants is relevant, right? There are rare cases where that might be the case, then that's not a problem. It's just that if you're writing your paper as each article is its own paragraph, that's not a research paper, right? Research paper is much more complex than that. You're really trying to make arguments, not just kind of insert information. And again, when we go through the lectures for this, I think a lot of this will make more sense, and some of the weekly writing practice will kind of get you ready for this. But I really want to point that out right now so that you have a better opportunity to craft a better proposal, which will need less revision going into your lit review. I don't want you to hear this for the first time, what a lit review should be once you're doing the lit review assignment. That's worth a lot more points than this assignment, right? That's where they all build on each other. So it's easy enough. You can make a few mistakes in the beginning and it's not going to really affect your grade overall. All right, so remember this is a basic version of a lit review. You're going to expand on it for your next writing assignment. So you're going to cover the preliminary research. So it doesn't have to be exhaustive. You're going to, even in your intro, you need to have, even in your lit review, you need to have a little intro section, right? So just with any new section, you need to kind of set up a little bit of what you're going to be talking about. It could be very brief, like 2-3 sentences. And then you're going to kind of set up like you did in your outline, go through the different concepts you discussed that you would look at in your literature review. And then you're going to end the lit review with a clear statement of your hypothesis that, you have grounded in the previous research that you just listed. And then as far as the basic methods section, in this section, you're going to outline what research you will conduct to study a research phenomenon. I know a lot of people often say in some of these things like, I'm going to, quote, look at research, or, quote, look at statistics. So that's not really a method, right? That's actually something that would be much more relevant in your literature review. If you're looking at things that already exist that someone else did as research, that's a lit review. That's reviewing the literature, right? That's literally seeing what's already out there. For your methods, you are doing the research. How are you going to conduct the research? So remember, you don't actually have to do the data collection or data analysis. You're just proposing that you're doing research. So if you said, oh, I'm going to do this thing on income inequality between, men and women, and I'm going to interview people at this particular job to see what their experiences are, you don't actually have to do the interviews. But you would for your method section, especially later on for the full method section that's due for the final paper, you would need to actually outline what your sociological method is going to be, what its limitations are. We'll get into all that crap later on. But basically, at this point, I want you to be thinking about what sociological research method could answer your question, your research question, right? Could it be interviews? Would it be surveys? Would it be looking at existing data sources like the census? If you were going to use existing data sources, you can't just say, I'm going to look at statistics. You need to be much more specific. For something that would be due for the final paper part of the methods, you would have to explain what data set you were going to use, what kind of statistical analysis you were planning to use on that data set. Because otherwise, just examining statistics is not really a method, right? Are you going to go out and collect the data that is then analyzed, or are you going to use an existing source that's relevant? And what is that existing source, right? So this is kind of one of those things, and it's totally normal at this point if you had written, I'm going to look at this or that, whatever. It's not a problem. You're still going to have plenty of time to kind of figure this out over time. And whatever you put for your proposal, if you're like way off base, I will mention it. But the way that this works is there's not really a right or wrong, right? You just pick one that you think fits to answer your question. So typically if you're asking a question that's more of a larger what kind of question, like what trends or what figures or habits or things that you see happening in a larger population, you're typically going to go with a quantitative research method. And we're going to go into this more in depth later, right? If you were looking at something more small scale, what are people's experiences or opinions or attitudes, right? And why do they feel the way that they feel? Then you would typically pick a qualitative research method, right? Such as interviews or ethnography or something like that to really kind of study more in depth from a low, a micro level, right? So there is no right or wrong. And even if we all had the same topic of income inequality, there's like 100 different ways we could approach it. So everyone in the class could still have a distinctly different paper. The idea is you just have to really be thinking like, how could I answer this question that I'm proposing? And if you have a question that's very difficult to answer, that's going to kind of help you at this point refine your question, because if your question scope is too large, like we did with the weekly writing assignment, if the scope is way too large, you get way too much research, right? You get a ton of stuff and it can be really hard to figure out what to include and what not to. If your research is so specific, then you only get a couple research studies and it's harder to extrapolate things or find more generalized research to apply to your paper. So sometimes you end up in this process kind of, changing or modifying, your topic, your research question, these things a little bit. That's totally fine. And if you even decided to do a completely different topic, completely different research question than your outline, that's fine with me. The idea is you do not have to go back and redo your outline or resubmit anything. These are really, as much as you're getting a grade for this, these steps are much more for you, just to help you develop how, at least the strategies that I've found over time are effective in helping students draft a paper without stress or anxiety. So, again, trying to remove stress and anxiety, you can clearly change at any point. Oftentimes people start doing the research and they realize, this is actually more interesting to me, or they realize maybe the topic isn't something they want to cover for the entire semester. That's totally fine. You do not have to go back and redo those things for me. I mean, I suggest you do them for you, especially if it's the outline, because that's really going to help you construct these things, right? It's very difficult to get writer's block when you have a very clear, kind of fleshed out outline. You would just skip that and go on to the next section and fill in that information, right? So the outline is a very important tool that will help you, but you do not have to resubmit anything to me, right? You're welcome to change how these things go. All right, so really, think about the method, but you don't have to really develop all the specificities now. That's something that'll develop as we develop more detailed drafts. As far as citations, the proposal should have references page that alphabetically lists the sources that you used in ASA format. There's a link here. There's stuff on Titanium about how to use ASA citations. Also in your book, they talk about the subheadings and these kind of things. So basically, with the reference page, I think the hardest thing that a lot of students suffer with is the hanging indent problem. Word pretends that it'll do it if you highlight it, and I guess some versions of Word actually work with that. Most of the time, it's not going to give you the hanging indent that you need. You just simply have to go to the part that you're trying to indent and press Enter, Enter, Delete, Enter, and then from that point you can press Tab and then tab in that line in the next line. So basically the hanging indent just means that the last name of the author that's alphabetical goes kind of all the way left justified, right? But then the next lines that follow it are all indented to the left. To the right. So basically the hanging indent is one of those things. It's easier like once you get used to it now so that it's not a problem at the final paper stage. So I do suggest as you go writing your drafts, you fill in the citations as you go, because sometimes you cut stuff out or you add stuff, and at the end of the paper you find you have either more citations in your reference page than you do in your paper or vice versa, and that can be a pain in the ass to try and go through and find all those things. So keep it updated as you go. As far as the proposal, specifics, I'm looking for double-spaced 12-point font. There has to be a minimum of 5 citations to receive full credit. So the length should be between 4 to 10 pages. Remember, I'm not really concerned about the length as much as I am about the content, right? So basically, if you're looking at 4 to 10, that's basically 2 to 5 pages, single-spaced, if you really think about it. So if you are able to effectively, in the double space 4 pages, state all the information that's needed above, good for you. It just would be almost impossible for me to do. But again, I'm long-winded. I know people have different writing styles. Some people are much more succinct than others. So I don't try to be very strict about the length as much as I am about the content. You guys will all be judged with the same rubric, with the same content. So that's really what I'm looking for there. And the proposal's worth a total of 40 points towards your overall paper. So it's an important step in the paper, and it's, a lot easier than the stuff that comes later. So if you have an effective proposal, all this is going to do is basically mean that your next assignment, the lit review, you already have pretty much half of that done, right? So, and then with the edits you're going to get back from myself, hopefully that's going to help you figure out where the strengths are, and how to kind of hone in on those, and how to kind of clear up some of the errors or weaknesses. All right, so hopefully this makes sense. Just wanted to give you guys a little review of this so that I could make sure everyone had the information that they needed going into this assignment.